In March of this year, my husband and I traveled to China. We visited the capital, Beijing, and several other cities. We thoroughly enjoyed our experience there and we learned a lot. But when we came home, we both commented that we felt a little bit like outsiders. It wasn't that we weren't welcome there, we just weren't aware of the cultural identity that China has created. The Chinese population enjoys a very strong cultural identity that has been ingrained in them since birth. It's existed for centuries and will exist for centuries to come. This strong cultural identity has given China a powerful platform when it comes to global political and economic affairs. In September, we went to Belgium, and we experienced the complete opposite. Belgium is one of the true melting pot countries in Europe. The national language is French, and a lot of the citizens in Belgium come from different European countries or else different worldwide countries. Because of this, Belgium does not experience a strong cultural identity, and this is apparent when it comes to international affairs. It's easy to see that in order to be a key player in global affairs, you have to have a strong foundation. It's a lot like a pyramid. You have to have that strong, wide base in order for the rest of the pyramid to stand strong. If the foundation is weak, then the rest of the pyramid will crumble. China has that incredibly strong foundation, and because of that, they've been able to become a prominent player in international political and economic affairs. Belgium has not. We noticed this, and our trips became the inspiration for our literature review and TED Talk this semester. We studied scholarly articles and journals, and we read them, and we studied globalization and economics and international politics. We synthesized our research and came to the conclusion that maintaining a strong national cultural identity and finding the correct balance of international cultural diversity is critical to maintaining global political success. When these are accomplished, people tend to lead happier and more focused lives. During this presentation, we will talk about creating a strong national cultural identity, as well as finding the correct balance with international cultural diversity. We will talk about how these both positively and negatively impact GDP growth, as well as national improvement. In 2017, leading international scholars Dai and Chen released a book titled Intercultural Harmony. Throughout this book, they discuss the positives and negatives of globalization. And one of the quotes from their book completely sums up our research conclusions. Quote, "Conflicts often arise as a result of disparate social preferences and incompatible value orientations. The greater the cultural distance, the greater the likelihood that there will be tension and misunderstanding." This book advocates for a proper balance of international cultural diversity. You can't be too far, or else you won't be able to work cohesively with other countries. Your strong national cultural identity has to be malleable and has to evolve with the times in order to be effective and efficient when it comes to global affairs.
A counter-argument to strong cultural diversity being needed for globalization is that it's all about the money. So GDP growth is central to global success and communications. International conflict is either over scarce resources or conflict of ideologies. International economist Schultz said, "It has long been known that increases in national income have been larger than increases in land, in physical reproducible assets, and in man hours. It is now known that investment in human capital or education is a substantial part of the explanation of the increases in national income that had heretofore been left out of accounting." Vargas and Lee continued to talk about and to counter Schultz. They claim that effective communication, especially globally, helps to maintain and expedite sustainable development. This means that communication impacts sustainable development profoundly, so that you have higher internal freedom financially and you have more to trade, addressing Schultz's point that GDP is central to global success. Vargas and Lee continue that communication and information poverty, a form of poverty that goes hand in hand with economic and social poverty, needs to be addressed in order to achieve sustainable development. Communication and information are essential conditions for development and affect every aspect of life. Therefore, communication and information poverty, despite being only one dimension of poverty, affects all other dimensions. So what Vargas and Lee are saying here is that as you communicate well, internally, you increase that human capital. So in order to have a strong international or global GDP, you need to have a strong internal communication network in order to build that human capital, which Schultz said was so important. Further, the second point of conflict of ideologies for international conflict, to address that, Berkeley also have the solution that as you communicate well and you build shared ground between nations, there's an understanding and acceptance, and communication flows freely. This is important. Cultural diversity is important in this because in order to have shared meaning, you have to have some sort of stand. So as you keep a strong cultural identity, you have something to base what you're going to relate others to. And you have a better base to relate to others because you know what your beliefs are for your nation.
So how do we build a strong national cultural identity? And how do we find the correct balance with international cultural diversity? An author and writer by the name of Robert Allen, in the Book of Kindness, once said, quote, "Cultural differences should not separate us from each other, but rather, cultural diversity brings a collective strength that can benefit all of humanity." So, creating and maintaining a specific cultural identity will help individual nations to succeed politically, enabling populations worldwide to live more focused and happier lives. After all, diversity is better than adversity. So, in order for me to address the second question, I like to point out three things and talk about those three things. Number one, when working with other people, communication is key, but not only communication will be a key factor in the success that we're looking for, but also cultural identity. Number two, growth is just as indispensable as cultural identity. And number three, cultural identification, not cultural assimilation. Cultural assimilation is simply defined as an individual or a group of people that leave behind all sets of cultures and values and everything that pertains to a specific culture just so that they can adapt to and adhere to a specific set of cultures defined as the norm. So what do I mean by cultural identification and not cultural assimilation? I mean to remember who you are and to not adhere to whatever the norm is. So our research shows that conflicts often arise as a result of desperate social preferences and incompatible value orientations. So therefore, because of our research, we know that cultural diversity is critical to global political success. Now, I'd like for you to think of this. If we are to preserve culture, we must continue to create it. But the question is, how do you preserve your culture? Or how do you create a culture? We have come up with an idea. And what we would like for you to do is to just write 3 things that you like about your country, or more specifically about your culture, and then share them on the internet. If you do those 3 things, you will be able to see how people begin to change and how people will begin to focus on who they are, and they begin to identify themselves as individuals who believe in culture. And the question still remains, even when you do those things, how do you create culture? Remember that when working with other people, communication is key. And the growth will be just as indispensable as this communication and just as this cultural identity. So to conclude, I'd like to point out that protecting cultural diversity is critical to global and political success. When we do these things, when we protect cultural diversity by focusing on growth and cultural identity, we will in turn change the way we live our lives by guaranteeing global political success.